Hey everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Esri Developer Summit. I'm Craig Cleveland, and for the next little while, I'm going to talk to you about ArcGIS Enterprise and architecting your deployment. Before we get started, let's talk a little bit about some of the assumptions and prerequisites for this session. It's definitely going to be helpful if you are familiar with ArcGIS Enterprise as a product and understand some of its basic and core capabilities. And it'll certainly be helpful if you're in a position where you're involved with architecting and or installing the Azure software. From a recommended prerequisites perspective, having prior familiarity with ArcGIS Server and understanding some of its concepts, like what an ArcGIS Server site is, as well as familiarity with system architecture concepts like virtual machines, load balancers, and DNS and the like will be very helpful. And then finally, from the bonus prerequisites, if you have prior familiarity with the ArcGIS Enterprise and its components, and you're familiar with the concept of federating an ArcGIS server site to the portal, that'll all be really helpful in helping you get the most out of this session. But certainly, it doesn't preclude you from joining us today. We're going to keep it relatively high level. We'll take a few deep dives along the way. By having some of that background will certainly be helpful. From the scope of what we'll cover today, we're going to look at the architecture of ArcGIS Enterprise as it relates from all the way back from version 10.5 up through the almost released version of 10.9. We will primarily focus our time on the components of a base enterprise deployment, but we will also discuss the additional server roles and how they can be used to expand your deployment and give you additional features, as well as how they can help you to scale out. So let's get started. Let's talk about the software components that make up ArcGIS Enterprise. From a base enterprise deployment perspective, there's 4 components that come together to make up ArcGIS Enterprise in that base deployment. It's the ArcGIS Web Adapter, Portal for ArcGIS, ArcGIS Server, and the ArcGIS Data Store. There are also other ArcGIS Enterprise components in the form of server roles that will help you to add additional capabilities to your deployment, like Notebook Server or other server roles that we're going to discuss in more detail later on in today's presentation. So, server licensing roles. ArcGIS Server actually comes in a number of different roles. There is the GIS Server, which is focused on that traditional sort of GIS role of the server, publishing out things like map services, feature services, geocoding services, and other things that have been around for a long time. Then you have the image server, which is focused on imagery and publishing out dynamic image services that are, live in our mosaic data sets and things of that nature. The GeoAnalytics Server, which is focused on big data and big data processing. The GeoEvent Server, which is focused on real-time data and managing that real-time data as it comes into your system, performing analytics in real time on that data. And the Notebook Server, which helps us to run Python via Jupyter Notebooks in a browser. So ArcGIS Server is really one software component that provides us multiple server roles, and each of those roles has different capabilities. It's important to note for those of you who are actually putting your hands on and doing the installing of the software beyond just the architecture, that the GeoEvent Server role actually requires installing the ArcGIS Server software as well as overlaying a GeoEvent Server setup. Notebook Server also is a little different in that it's actually a separate download and install that doesn't require the ArcGIS Server setup. So while logically we can think of ArcGIS Server in these individual roles, when it comes down to the technical details with some of these roles, they're just a little bit different in terms of how they're physically deployed and installed. So let's talk about coming from an ArcGIS Server to an ArcGIS Enterprise. There's probably a lot of you who have been around the industry for a while and are very familiar with this typical deployment of an ArcGIS Server. That idea of a web adapter an ArcGIS server, and then maybe a Geodatabase or data sources on disk. That was a very traditional pattern or paradigm for deploying an ArcGIS server and service enabling content. And that's actually still out there and certainly still valid. However, as we move towards the more modern GIS environment, we look towards a base deployment of ArcGIS Enterprise, which is going to give us a whole lot more capability. And so that is made up, as we talked about briefly a few slides earlier, of the Web Adapter, in this case, two of them, one for Portal and one for ArcGIS Server. And of course, we have the Portal for ArcGIS, the ArcGIS Server, which is in the form of a hosting server in this case, the ArcGIS Data Store as in the relational and tile cache flavors. And then we can even still have those connections out to enterprise geodatabases or other content that's on disk. That's certainly still a very valid paradigm to utilize those data sources and bring those into our base deployment of an ArcGIS Enterprise. Let's break these pieces down a little bit more and talk about what they are and what they do and how they function within our base deployment. The ArcGIS Web Adapter is a piece of software that's going to integrate with your organization's web server and give you a single endpoint that distributes incoming requests and enables you to use web tier authentication. So it will take traffic that is, now on a well-known port like 443 HTTPS, and it'll manage those requests and send them to the appropriate internal ports of Portal for ArcGIS, which is 7443, and ArcGIS Server, which is 6443. And it'll allow you to take advantage of those signed certificates that are, at your web server and really provide that integration there with your organization's web server environment. Portal for ArcGIS is really the piece that enables the ArcGIS Enterprise portal. This is both the web front end and the API backend. This is where most likely the majority of users will interact with our base deployment. This is where they'll go to create maps and create content and really support that user interaction and overall experience. But we often forget that it does provide that API backend as well, which is a very important component. We then have ArcGIS Server, which in the case of a base deployment, we're using it in the role of a hosting server. And it uses a GIS server licensing role, which we then designated as the hosting server. And then it gives us the ability to publish and share maps from ArcGIS Pro, from other locations that we might have on disk, and enables a great deal of workflows and capabilities that we wouldn't otherwise have if it weren't in the hosting server role, like self-service, mapping and enabling self-service workflows, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well. Next up is we have the ArcGIS Data Store. This is the managed data repository of a base enterprise deployment. This is going to store the enterprise portal's what we call hosted content. And it is absolutely not a replacement for your enterprise geodatabase. This is another option and another place that we can store content. And we think about it in terms of helping to enable those self-service workflows. And it's just one other option for you to store content. It comes in three flavors: the relational and tile cache, which are a part of the base deployment. The relational will help us to support hosted services. Tile cache, those scene services or 3D services. And then there's also the spatial temporal, which is not part of the base deployment, but that will help us with big data workflows. It will be used in conjunction with GeoEvent and Geo Analytics Server, which we'll touch on a bit later in the presentation. Finally, of course, we can have our enterprise geodatabase. This is for user managed data that lives in those organizational repositories. And we can also could extend this out to think about, file-based data that lives on disk, whether locally on servers or on network drives. Okay. So the base enterprise deployment, if you'd like some more details about this, we have really great documentation on this that speaks to that. When you get the slides afterwards, there's a link to this documentation, and it'll help you to kind of dig into those pieces a little bit more and learn more about them. So I encourage you to take a look at that after the presentation today. So what functionality do we get from a base deployment? If we've moved from that more traditional just ArcGIS server deployment, now we've decided to buy in and go to the base deployment, what do we get from that? What's the advantages? Well, we certainly get everything that would come from a traditional ArcGIS server, like the ability to publish map, feature, network, GP, geocoding services, publishing content from those reference data sources. All that same capability is still there. That is still absolutely possible. Where we grow from it is now getting into these self-service mapping workflows, where people who are more casual GIS users, or maybe not GIS users at all, but they have a need to take a CSV or a zipped up shapefile and create a service endpoint out of it. They can now do that through these self-service mapping workflows that are provided by the base enterprise. We also have configurable application templates. So how can we take our content, the work that we do, and share that out to these larger audiences? We can now do so by creating web maps and sharing those into these great templates, of which there are many, like the attachment viewer, the minimalist, time aware, or just to name a few. And now we can create these configured apps without having to have been a developer or direct access to a web server. It's really all happening just through their web browser, which is really quite powerful. Of course, we get, if the configurable apps don't quite meet our needs, we have the ability to use the Experience Builder and Web App Builder, and we can have an even more configurable experience to really tailor the functionality and capability of an app. We get access to story maps and dashboards and even enterprise sites to customize those landing pages for our portals. Very tailored apps to deal with storytelling of our content, or dashboards that might help us look at more real-time data and give us situational awareness around an event. We have the full access to the suite of Esri native applications, right? They can utilize that base enterprise backend. So field maps and Survey 123 and Quick Capture can all utilize it. And then finally, of course, we can build custom apps that use our base enterprise environment as a foundation for those apps, whether they're web apps or mobile or desktop apps. They can all be powered by the content that's in our base enterprise deployment. So now we know a bit about a logical base deployment. We know a little bit about the parts. Well, let's talk about deploying it. How do we want to do that? So the first thing you need to think about is choosing a pattern that works for you. You can go into a single machine deployment where we take all the different parts of ArcGIS Enterprise and put those on a single machine. And actually, this is a great way to go for many small to medium organizations. It will generally meet all their needs. I think a lot of people will oftentimes immediately start to break these out into tiers, and it isn't necessary all the time. So a single machine deployment will work very well for a lot of organizations and support a good deal of users. Now, if you do have a larger organization or more users, or users that are doing more with your environment, and you see the need that will come in the future that you will need to scale up and out for your system based off of those usage patterns, you can absolutely deploy the individual parts of ArcGIS Enterprise onto different machines. This will give you the greatest flexibility in terms of growth down the road and allow you to expand out your deployment both vertically and horizontally to meet the needs of your organization. I would just say, as we leave this slide and thinking about, is the single machine or a multi-machine approach right for you? Think about, how big of an organization you are, how many users you're going to have, and what those existing and future needs might look like, because often the single machine deployment will work extremely well for you. Next up, once we've made the decision to deploy on either a single machine or multi-machine is how do we bring these parts together to give us that complete base enterprise deployment in a ready-to-use state? The first thing we're going to do is configure our web adapters. We're actually going to configure two of them, one for Portal for ArcGIS and one for ArcGIS Server, which is in our hosting server role. Next up, we're going to configure the data store, the relational and tile cache data store in this case, and register it with our hosting server. That's going to bring those two pieces together. And then finally, we're going to federate our hosting server with the portal and designate it as such, as the hosting server. And at this point, we now have a completely installed and configured base enterprise deployment. We have a great tutorial in our online documentation that speaks to this, and I would highly encourage all of you that haven't done this yet, or maybe you've only deployed once and you're still uncertain about some of the steps, is to work through this document and get an appreciation for how those things install and how they come together. It can really help your understanding of the different moving parts and how they work together. That being said, though, installing these things by hand in a very singular fashion and configuring them together is probably not the best path moving forward. We have a number of automated deployment options that will help you out depending on where you're deploying and what your deployment looks like. So the ArcGIS Enterprise Builder is one option that you can use that has a one-click like install experience. So if you are going to have a base deployment on a singular machine, this will allow you to not have to move through all those individual executables and all those configuration steps. You will provide a few inputs in the beginning, and then you will let this run and it'll install all the different components as well as configure them. And it really makes it a much easier and quicker experience. So at the end of the day, this is a good experience for our GIS professionals or developers that are looking to get that base deployment on a single machine and do it in the quickest and simplest way possible. If we're working in the cloud, we have additional options. Both on AWS and Azure, we provide machine images that you can launch from the AWS console or the Azure portal. And then you could go in and manually configure the pieces if you launch that way. Or you can use our cloud builders, which is desktop software that will allow you to deploy either a base deployment as well as individual server roles and give you even more flexibility than the enterprise builder will provide. Also have additional options there beyond just launching the images from the console or the cloud builder. On AWS, you have the CloudFormation templates you could utilize that we provide, and you could use the AWS CLI as well. We also provide automation tools for those that need even more flexibility, regardless of the environment that you're working in. If you're on premises or in the cloud, and you really need to tailor your deployment, the PowerShell DSC as well as Chef cookbooks that we provide will give you the full capability and full control of how you deploy in a very automated fashion. So this is really good for those folks who are sort of in a DevOps role and need that level of flexibility in terms of their deployment patterns. Let's move beyond the base deployment now. We've talked about what that is, how we might architect that in terms of the machines that it's deployed on, and we've talked about some ways in which we can do that using automation tools. Let's say we need to scale this out, right? So we need to move beyond that. What does scaling and expanding a base deployment from a portal perspective look like? When do you need to scale out the portal tier? It's actually rare that you need to do this. Usually CPU and memory is not going to drive your scaling needs here. Often this will come down to storage considerations. So, can we do we have enough disk space locally to deal with that? So we might need to expand out disk space if we're referencing locally or on network storage, or we have the ability to put our storage in the cloud, which would essentially give us infinite expansion capabilities there. But that's usually where we'll do some of the scaling. Portal for ArcGIS is often going to scale up, where we need to provide more resources for our existing machines. So we can provide additional CPU and memory as needed. Now, from a scaling out perspective, when we use multiple machines for Portal for ArcGIS, this is for high availability purposes, right? This is not actually for scaling out. It's to give you the resiliency that you need and to give you that high availability requirement if your organization needs that. Okay? So what do we think about here when we're talking about scaling and it comes to Portal? Monitor your CPU and memory usage, scale up if necessary, and then keep an eye on that storage and then scale out that storage as needed. From the server perspective, when are we going to need to scale out our ArcGIS server hosting server site? A lot of times this will boil down to if our hosting server is doing double duty. What we mean by that is it carrying the capacity of hosted services, right? Those self-service mapping workflows, as well as traditional services, GP service, geocoding services. In this case, what we want to start to think about is adding additional ArcGIS server sites to our deployment where we can separate out workloads. So we could put our hosted services just on our hosting server, and then those other service types on a separate ArcGIS server and start to isolate that workload a bit to focus what each ArcGIS server in our site is doing. The resources on a hosting server become an issue sometimes when we're serving a lot of requests for hosted feature layers. If there's a lot of hits there, if your users make heavy use of the built-in analysis tools, whether in the map viewer or ArcGIS Pro, as well as if you have a lot of ArcGIS Insights users, which relies heavily on the hosting server. So in these cases, when do we scale out and expand our base deployment? Think about if our server's doing double duty and consider adding another ArcGIS server site to separate out workload. And then as needed, you can add more machines to your ArcGIS server site to give you that extra capacity and resiliency as needed. From the data tier, when do we need to scale out our ArcGIS data store tier? We think about this when one data store type might begin to impact another. So if our relational data store is getting so much use based off of the hosted feature layers or ArcGIS Insights use, and we're really pushing our tile cache data store and the scene layers and the 3D layers, and those things are starting to impact one another. This is when we really want to keep an eye on those system resources, particularly CPU, can become an issue and a bottleneck for us, as well as memory when we have a lot of hosted services and insights related work that's going on there. So on the data tier, think about a tool like ArcGIS Monitor to monitor this environment and give us some understanding of the CPU usage, memory usage, and disk I/O. Those are all important factors for our data store tier. We could even isolate out the relational data store to a machine as well as our tile cache data store to a machine. Again, separate workloads. So that's also possible. Something to keep in mind if there's those of you in the audience that are still using some older versions, pre 10.5.1, we didn't always handle out of disk space conditions gracefully with the data store, gracefully. So, really think about upgrading to the latest versions to avoid some of those out of disk space errors. We handle that much more gracefully now, where we'll put a data store into a read-only mode if we got close. So one more reason to think about to get to the latest and greatest versions. Again, just for a point of reference here, when we're talking about the data store in the context of the base deployment and when to scale it, we're not talking about the spatial temporal big data store, right? That's not a part of our base deployment. That obviously supports our GeoEvent server and GeoAnalytics server, And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation. So expanding out from the base deployment and thinking about more capabilities, right? So adding new server roles. There's a couple of starting points to consider here. One thing that is true is that we can have as many federated ArcGIS server sites as we want with our environment. So you can add additional server sites to manage workload, to add capacity, to add capability. But just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. I think one of the things I personally believe in very much so is to not overcomplicate a deployment unnecessarily, right? Does a single machine accomplish what you want? Does a single GIS server accomplish what you want? And if it doesn't, then certainly let's add those additional federated sites and additional server roles and give you the capabilities that you need. But always weigh that in terms of the complication of your deployment and whether it's necessary. No need to have more resources in there for you to manage if you don't need them. Also, as you add different server roles to add capability, keep in mind that there are different recommendations and restrictions and requirements for the server roles. Not everything acts exactly like the GIS server, so we need to think about that specific server role and what its needs are. So, expanding out from that base deployment and thinking about ways to do it. Well, we talked about adding additional GIS server sites to give us capacity and separate out workloads. But what about additional capabilities and adding things like an image server to get the dynamic on-the-fly processed image services, or GeoEvent Server because we have real-time data needs? Or how about a GeoAnalytics Server because we're working on big data workflows and processing? Notebook server to help us with those, being able to write Python in a browser via Jupyter Notebooks, or one of our newest server roles, which is Mission Server, that can help you with situational awareness related workflows and real-time access out in the field to our mobile users and understanding that, as well as a business analyst server that can provide us some business content and business analytics. Right? All of these are things that can add additional capability to our base enterprise deployment and bring more value to our users. So let's look at these individual pieces and parts, starting with the GIS server. As you know, you already have a GIS server site as a part of the base deployment. That's your hosting server. And then you need to think about whether you need additional sites in there. Does it make sense for you to do the workload separation? Do I have a server that maybe manages GP services and those that manage all my other server types? We need to think about that. Common workloads that can benefit from that separate site: highly used dynamic map services. They'll be very intensive. Heavyweight geoprocessing, right? Not all GP services are the same. CPU intensive routing services. And of course, mission critical services that might have different SLAs. Those are great use cases for when we might want to have an additional GIS server that has a focused workload and capability. Something you might not be aware of just yet is the notion of shared instances. At ArcGIS Enterprise 10.7, we introduced this concept, and what it will do is it'll allow map services to use a shared memory pool, which will really help with memory consumption of your map services, right? Those map services should no longer really drive out our scaling in and of themselves. They shouldn't. The number of requests might drive us to scale out, not necessarily the number of services, because now we can have them sharing that memory pool as opposed to the past where each individual service had a dedicated memory allocation to it. So I encourage you to look more into the shared instances. I have some resources at the end of the presentation today that you might want to dig into more, but that's a great way to help you deal with memory consumption and better utilization of an individual server by taking advantage of the shared instances capability. Looking at this from a deployment perspective, we have our base deployment there in the box. Now what we can do is we can federate a GIS server to that base deployment and bring that additional capability to our users. We can have many GIS server sites, as we talked about. So looking at this visually to see where we've now begun to separate out workload and added a GIS server focused on geoprocessing, one focused on public-facing maps, and then the remainder for our mapping and visualization needs that might be happening internally to the organization. And of course, we have our GIS server that's acting in the hosting server role. So this is one way you might architect that to meet those additional needs that you have. How about the image server? What is that going to bring to us from a capability perspective? Well, there's really 4 key things it's going to deliver. First is it's going to give us the ability to provide dynamic image services from our own Mosaic data sets. This is a great way to serve large collections of imagery, LiDAR, and other raster types that take advantage of dynamic mosaicing and on-the-fly processing. We can also have an image server. If we federate it, we then have the ability to designate it as a raster analytics site. This is going to allow us to do things like extract information from our imagery, do distributed processing and analysis on that imagery, and create rasters as a result of that work. Do that work whether at the desktop in ArcGIS Pro or in a browser using some of the capabilities from the map viewer. We can only have one of these raster analytics sites per our enterprise deployment. So keep that in mind. We can bring that in, but we only get one per enterprise deployment. Somewhat similar to the raster analytics site, we can have a raster hosting site. So this is also an image server that's been federated to our enterprise and they designated in this role. And what this will allow for is those self-service workflows in the portal where users can take individual images or collections of images, bring them to the portal, and then spin up a hosted image service within the portal. So you can also use it to host results of raster analytics. So it's really quite powerful in unlocking some of that self-service capabilities and workflows. Finally, we have an image service can bring us the ortho mapping capability. This is really to help enable the OrthoMaker application. This is going to do some server-side processing of satellite, aerial, and drone imagery and help us create products like DTMs, DEMs, and orthomosaics and other things of that nature. Looking at that in the diagram, here's again our base deployment in the box there, and then we've added an image server site to it. So we have one image server site. Now we have the ability to do that creation of those image services, the dynamic image services, orthomosaicing, auto corrections on the fly. We can also add additional image server sites and then designate those in the roles for the portal where we can say, hey, this is our image server that's going to do raster hosting and enable those workflows where I can create an image service from a file that I have on disk. And then we can also have one that will be in the raster analytics role and allow us to do those raster-based analyses within our enterprise environment. How about the GeoAnalytics Server? The GeoAnalytics Server is going to give us the ability to do distributing, computing. We're processing large volumes of vector and tabular data. So similar to the raster hosting and raster analytics roles, we can only have one GeoAnalytics server per enterprise deployment. This is the first capability that we've talked about that requires a spatial temporal big data store to be configured with our base deployment. So that third flavor of the data store is required for us to utilize a GeoAnalytics server. A note here, Anytime you're configuring a data store of any kind, relational, tilecast, or spatial temporal, you always configure that with the hosting server. I know that's tripped me up personally, so we'd like to mention that here. GeoAnalytics Server will understand that it's there and available when it is federated into the enterprise environment, and it will know that that spatial temporal big data store is there. But we always configure that against the hosting server. Now we need to have a machine that has at least 16 gigs of memory and at most 64 for the spatial temporal big data store. So there's a lot going on there in terms of its memory requirements depending on the quantity of work that we're going to be doing. There's a lot of variables that go into sizing a GeoAnalytics server deployment. More machines and more cores and more memory doesn't always mean faster processing. Many workflows will benefit quite a bit from just a singular machine setup, actually. So if possible, scale a single machine. It's certainly simpler to manage, right? Scale that up, give it more resources, and then scale out to 3 machines as needed. But when it comes to GeoAnalytics Server, only a single or 3 machine configuration is supported. Before we leave this and look at the diagram, it's important to talk about some of those things that will affect the performance of GeoAnalytics Server. There's a lot of variables that go into here. Think about what types of data you're going to be working with, whether file or web-based or big data stores. Where is that data? Is it local? Is it on the network? If it's on a local network, what's that pipe look like? Is it 100 megabits per second, a gigabit per second? Are we able to saturate it as needed to do this work? The storage. We're talking about solid state drives or traditional spinning disks. The size of the data. Tens of megabytes, hundreds, gigabytes, terabytes. How big is this? It's also important to consider the ratio of CPU cores to RAM. We need to have those things be in alignment to be able to get the best performance out of this. And then, of course, we need to have the ability to write the resultant data as fast as it's being generated. So we also need to be thinking about scaling the spatial temporal big data store when we scale our GeoAnalytics server. So bring those things into the fold as you're considering it. Do prototyping to help you land on the right configuration for you. Here's what this looks like from a diagram perspective. Please note on the left side, we've added in the spatial temporal big data store, right? So we need that in addition to the GeoAnalytics server site. And then we have the ability in this case to add additional nodes to our spatial temporal big data store, and we can scale out that GeoAnalytics server right to 3 machines here. So as needed, we can scale those things both up and out, but we have to go from 1 to 3 nodes when we're talking about GeoAnalytics server. Next up on our list is the GeoEvent Server. When we're talking about adding GeoEvent Server, we're talking about the ability to process real-time data, both ingesting it, doing on-the-fly processing, amazing things with understanding when something has crossed into a geographic boundary or when it's crossed out, how long has it resided in a certain location. So that real-time data needs, this is when you're going to bring your GeoEvent Server into the fold. For a number of releases now, it has been possible to create multi-machine GeoEvent sites as needed. Each site that, a multi-machine site, I apologize there. Each site must be powerful enough to handle peak throughput for the combined set of GeoEvent services. So really scaling up when it comes to GeoEvent can be tremendously helpful. If you have multiple input streams that go on beyond a single site, consider adding additional separate GeoEvent server sites. So maybe we'll have many sites to handle all those input streams and all the volume of data that's coming through there. Finally, if you're archiving large volumes of data, be sure to introduce the spatial temporal big data store to help you to archive off that content. So much like GeoAnalytics Server required it, GeoEvent Server can utilize it. It isn't required, but it can certainly be helpful if you're dealing with the large volumes of data. Again, back to our diagram here, we can see this pattern, repeating itself where we're now taking an additional ArcGIS server role, in this case GeoEvent, federating it to our base deployment. And as needed, we can add a spatial temporal big data store to our GeoEvent servers to help us with that archiving of the large volumes of data. And we can also scale out our individual GeoEvent server sites to multiple machines for that resiliency and capacity as needed. The last server role we're going to look at today is our notebook server. This is one of our newer server roles that was introduced at 10.7. And Notebook Server provides that web-based interface for executing powerful geospatial analysis in your portal. Jupyter Notebooks, being able to write that Python code right there in the browser and have that as a part of your enterprise deployment offers a lot of capability to your users. So this has a different deployment model in that it is deployed with Docker on a dedicated machine. It is supported on both Windows and Linux. However, there's a strong recommendation for Notebook Server to utilize a Linux backend because of the work that it does with Docker and the native capabilities there. So this is one of the exceptions where we might say, even if you have a Windows-oriented base deployment, it's a good idea to deploy this server role on Linux to take a better advantage of some of those native capabilities and get the better performance out of your notebook server. Looking at our diagram here one last time, we have our base deployment. We'll bring that notebook server to the table by federating that with our portal and designating it in that particular role. As we start to come to a conclusion here, let's think about some other considerations for enterprise deployments. Additional patterns and considerations, things that we haven't talked about today, but are going to be very important to you as you consider your particular architecture and deployment. High availability. Is that needed for you? Do you need that level of resiliency? This is going to require some duplicate infrastructure. There will be some licensing implications. So that's something you're going to need to think about. Load balancers and management. Do you need to integrate with particular capabilities that are required by your organization in terms of IT and security? Do you need to integrate with those things? That's something you're going to want to think about. Performance testing and scalability, making sure that your deployment meets all the needs that are required of it. So testing it and making sure that is true. Also, for those of you that work in environments that are accessible to the internet, hybrid deployments, how do you want to take advantage of ArcGIS Line? Do you want to use things like distributed collaboration to move public-facing content out there for the public? This is a great way to expand your environment beyond just your internal users. So I really encourage you to think about how that might fit into your architecture. And then if you're migrating a deployment, there's a lot of considerations in there as well. So moving to new servers or new operating systems, or if you're thinking about going from on-premises to the cloud or separating out components, all of these things in these lists, we really don't cover in this session. There are other sessions that will speak to some of these, but maybe talk to our professional services team and understand how these will affect you and in ways in which you want to be thinking about them as it relates to your deployment. Some best practices I'd like to leave you with. For those of you that have been with ArcGIS Server specifically for a long time, you might be familiar with the concept of clustering. Please do not use that anymore on those older versions of ArcGIS Server. It is discouraged on any version and has been officially deprecated at 10.5.1 and not even supported starting with ArcGIS Enterprise 10.7. So let's stay away from that and move away from it if we're still hanging around on that. Do federate your ArcGIS Server sites. If you want to take advantage of some of those capabilities that we spoke about, they will require federation. Raster analytics, GeoAnalytics, Notebook Server, they will require you to take advantage of that newer functionality. So think about taking advantage of that shared security and sharing model. Don't ever unfederate your ArcGIS Server site. There's a lot of ramifications to this, broken links, broken apps, disappointed users when their content now has problems. If you ever find yourself in a place where you find that to be a necessity, please reach out to our tech support team and talk that through with them and see if that is really a requirement for you. Do use the web adapter. If there are exceptions to this, if you have F5s or other load balancers in your organization, but if you're not as familiar with that and you don't have access to those, really encourage you to use the web adapter. It will simplify a lot of your configuration and a lot of the use cases when it comes to your web server integration. So from a takeaway perspective, really understand your base deployment and what each part adds and when you want to add those things. Don't overcomplicate things unnecessarily. A lot of times a single machine deployment can really be beneficial and do everything you need. Stay up to date on your best practices. They certainly change over time. ArcGIS Enterprise relies on the federated server model. Certain features require that federated server model to work, like our raster and GeoAnalytics servers. And then understand the individual server roles and the requirements of each. Obviously, they're different as we talked about today, so think about those as you bring them into the fold. I want to leave you with one last thing to take a look at, one more technical paper, and that is the Architecting the ArcGIS System Best Practices, very recently updated. We'll cover a lot of the concepts that we covered in our presentation today, as well as much more. So please take a look at that paper. That's a great resource to have at your fingertips at any time. And then please provide your feedback for this session by clicking on the session survey link directly below the video. That's helpful to me as a presenter and to us as an organization to understand, what we've done well and where we can improve to help bring you the content that you need to be successful when working with ArcGIS Enterprise. So thank you everyone for your time today. I really appreciate it. I hope to see you back in person in 2022. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the live Q&A. Craig and I have been diligently trying to answer questions that you might have on the Slido on the right-hand side of your screen, but for those questions that we weren't able to get to during the live portion, we'll be addressing some of those questions live during this live Q&A session.
Awesome. I think we've got a great one here, Jeremy, that I want to throw your way and see if you can help answer this and give us a little more better understanding about it. So a question came in that said, can you explain what federation of an ArcGIS server with an enterprise portal means in terms of architecture? What does that federation do, and what advantages and disadvantages are there to that federation?
Yeah, it's a great question. Federation is really an important part of ArcGIS Enterprise. Federation establishes a trust between your server roles, so GIS Server, for example, and your portal for ArcGIS. And that trust allows a certain level of single sign-on between those systems, so that when you share an item in portal, it automatically affects and impacts the sharing and the security of that service inside of the GIS server. So federation is really important because it also unlocks the ability for those server roles to take advantage of whatever kind of authentication that you've put in front of your ArcGIS Enterprise. So if your organization is using SAML logins, using Azure AD, the only way to take advantage of that in your GIS server is through federation. So federation definitely provides that single sign-on experience between your backend server roles into the full ArcGIS Enterprise experience through that sharing model.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, gladly. We're going to try and find another question for you, Craig. So someone actually asked, can I register my GeoEvent server with a web adapter? And do I need to register GeoEvent do I need to federate it with Portal?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's always exceptions to every rule, and GeoEvent Server is the one role that we have, the one ArcGIS Server role that does not have the ability to connect to a web adapter. So if we access the GeoEvent Manager, we do so over port 6143. Now I work with some customers who will take advantage of things like load balancers or reverse proxies to kind of deal with that. But there isn't a web adapter for the GeoEvent server. Now we are able to federate it with the portal, and as we've talked about throughout the session and some of the Q&A, we do recommend federation. Jeremy, you just talked about the idea of taking advantage of that shared security and sharing model. So we absolutely can federate it with our portal, and then that way we can use our portal identities to connect to our GeoEvent server.
Are there other server roles, Craig, that also can or don't require federation, I guess I should say?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, we do recommend it, right, because of the reasons you talked about, but those that will really require federation and then what we call designation in a particular role are GeoAnalytics Server. And if we have an image server that we want to be a raster analytics server or an image hosting server, those will all require federation such that they can be designated in that role with our enterprise portal.
So it sounds like to take advantage of the full sort of the full capabilities of that software, you both federate as well as hosting.
Yeah, designation, and again, the designation will boil down to what you want to use that particular server role for. Yep.
Great. Now we've seen a number of questions come through today about Kubernetes, so I just wanted to address the fact that there is a session later today on ArcGIS Enterprise on Kubernetes. So that will be happening later this afternoon. So there were a couple folks asking about licensing and also deployment patterns and containerization in the cloud. So we definitely want to encourage attendance at that session as well.
Yeah, great. That's definitely a new deployment paradigm coming up here shortly. Absolutely.
Great. Let's tackle a couple more of these questions if we can.
Okay. I have one for you here, Jeremy. I think your professional services background will lend well to this one. So there's a question. We talked in the presentation about deploying to a single machine or a multi-tiered deployment. A lot of reasons go into that. What resources do we have access to? How big will our deployment be? But let's say we needed to migrate from, say, a single machine to a tiered deployment. We need to scale up. Do you have any thoughts on how we might tackle that problem?
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's been a number of comments and questions as well today in the chat about single machine deployments. One of the things that we often talk about is anticipating the need for growth. One of the best ways to anticipate the need for growth is to make sure that you store your ArcGIS server components, or I should say the directories, the configuration stores, those components on a shared drive, for example, so that you don't actually have to go through the process of reconfiguration later. So if you're using drive letter paths that are local to the system, either referencing them via a UNC path or putting them on some sort of file share somewhere else is a really great way of making sure that it's easy to move components or add additional components, such as an additional GIS server that you want to convert your single machine GIS server into a multi-machine site.
Yeah, that's great. I think a lot of what that points out, Jeremy, is how flexible this is, and that's one of the things I always, as I talk to customers about how to do this. There is no one size fits all, right? And there's always, what are your organizational needs? What are your skill sets? What do you have access to? And there's a lot of flexibility. And then both, if you start in one methodology, you can migrate to another. So that's great.
Yeah, along those lines, Craig, the question that got the most thumbs up in the chat is the one that talks about quantifying the number of users in relation to a deployment pattern. Such as a single machine deployment. And I think this speaks volumes here where it really depends not just on the number of users, but also the number of services, the types of services, the types of server roles that are in that deployment. So it really just depends on what your data and what your system also looks like.
Yeah, that's a good one. Jeremy, before you throw the next zinger at me, I want to address one that's come up here a lot. I answered it probably 3 or 4 times, and I think there's 3 or 4 other folks who answered it. or asked it, excuse me, around the web adapter, and is that required? And so I just want to state it here in the live Q&A that the web adapter is not required if you don't need enterprise authentication, as well as if you have something else to act as a reverse proxy, like a load balancer or something of that nature, to help move your traffic from those internal 7443 and 6443 ports for portal and server respectively, to well-known port 443. So it isn't a requirement, but if you're going to do enterprise authentication, if you don't have easy access to things like a load balancer, it's a great tool to help you, simply and easily get there. And we certainly, would recommend using it in the majority of cases.
Yeah, and there's a really good question actually that just came through about upgrading, which I just want to address as well, which is, we do support upgrading. So a lot of organizations have standalone ArcGIS server sites, and that is a common practice. You're not required to federate your ArcGIS server to your GIS server to ArcGIS Enterprise, but if you want to add those systems in later on, you can choose to do that. And the way you would do that is you would simply do a normal upgrade, an in-place upgrade, if you will, or by migrating to a new machine, however you choose to do that. But then you can choose to federate those later on. So it's definitely possible to basically take a pre-existing ArcGIS server that might be standalone and add that to your ArcGIS Enterprise implementation.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's actually something I've done a lot recently with some older sites that I have that I wanted to, upgrade and then bring into my enterprise deployment. I know we're getting close here on time, but I think I have another good one that I'd like to send your way if I can, Jeremy. I think it actually speaks in many ways to the first question which we brought up, but maybe we can just double down on this one. The question was that it's a good corporate practice today to use single sign-on. And that's a good reason to is that a good reason to federate an enterprise at all? And I think that's pretty rhetorical, but maybe you could double down on that answer for us.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing we like to say as well is single sign-on often means things like different things to different organizations and different users in those organizations as well. So when we talk about federation, we're talking about the sense that whatever you're federating, so let's just say the GIS server, it is now using the portal identity model for its authentication. So however you've secured your portal is now how you have secured your ArcGIS server and the GIS server role that you might be using. So yes, it's definitely a recommendation to use federation in that scenario.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Do we have time for one more here?
I think we can do it.
All right. I have one here that came in that wanted just a quick reiteration of some of the ways in which we can deploy ArcGIS Enterprise today. A lot of the ways that I learned early on was I was installing multiple EXEs or files on Linux, but now there's a lot of great tools for automation. And we touched on those briefly here today, and there's some other great resources that we can share. But things like the Enterprise Builder, if you have a base deployment on one machine, both Windows and Linux, and then the tooling on the cloud side, so Cloud Builder for AWS and Azure, CloudFormation templates, and then for those folks that really need the most flexibility, using Chef or even PowerShell DSC. So there are lots of ways to do deployment that don't require us as individuals to do a lot of connectivity via a lot of hands-on movement, right? We can get a process rolling and have a lot of things automated.
Definitely. Just want to address, we've got lots of questions still that we haven't been able to get to so far. We're doing our best to respond. If your name is associated with that item, we'll try to follow up with you for anything we weren't able to get to today. And we'll continue to look through the questions and try to respond to them to the best of our abilities. But definitely a lot of great questions coming through. Another good one, if we have just one more minute, is about integrating something like your RDBMS and ArcGIS Enterprise. And I guess I just want to address the fact that ArcGIS Enterprise is definitely a complete system that allows you to integrate with your geospatial data, and oftentimes that data is stored in an RDBMS like Postgres or SQL Server or Oracle. So typically that's where your data would be stored in an enterprise geodatabase, and services would be published from Postgres in that fashion. I know we're short on time here, so I think we're just about to wrap up.
Yep, I think if we can say, Jeremy, we'd love everybody to fill out that survey link on the site and give us that feedback that we need to tailor these sessions, to best meet your needs in the future. So,
all right, thanks everyone. Enjoy your conference.
yeah, thank you everyone. Hopefully see you in person next year.